Imagine being born into a world where the cards are already stacked against you, where the color of your skin, the language you speak, or the class of your parents determines your destiny. This is not just the past. It's a haunting legacy that still shadows our present. In Chapter 8 of Sapiens, Yuval Noah Harari tackles one of the most profound and uncomfortable truths about human history. Injustice is not an accident. It is a feature of the systems that humans built. From empires to castes, from patriarchy to racism, Harari pulls back the curtain on how inequality wasn't merely born of greed or cruelty, but was embedded deep into the very social fabric of ancient and modern civilizations. But how did we allow these systems to emerge, thrive, and persist for so long? The birth of structural inequality. Harari begins by challenging one of the core assumptions of many liberal ideologies, that all humans are created equal. While this belief underpins modern democracies and human rights charters, the historical reality is far more disturbing. For most of history, societies were built on rigid hierarchies, and these hierarchies weren't natural, they were manufactured. He introduces the idea that most social hierarchies are imagined orders, stories we tell ourselves and each other. The idea that nobles were superior to peasants, or that one race was better than another, didn't come from biology. It came from myths, religions, and institutions that reinforced those beliefs over generations. These imagined orders gained legitimacy through cultural institutions, religious traditions, and legal systems. Once embedded, they became self-fulfilling. People born into privilege had more access to education and wealth, which reinforced their superior status, while those born into oppression often lacked the means to rise, further entrenching the divide. Caste, class, and the machinery of discrimination. One of the most powerful examples Harari uses to explore this topic is the Indian caste system. Unlike the more flexible class systems in the West, caste dictated not just your economic role, but your very identity. From birth to death, it defined what you could wear, eat, do, even whom you could touch. What's particularly chilling is how such a rigid system could persist for millennia. It was sustained by a powerful combination of religious doctrine, social pressure, and intergenerational transmission. Those who challenged the hierarchy weren't just punished, they were shunned by the community and often met with violence. This isn't ancient history. Harari makes it clear that the ghosts of these systems are still with us. Though modern India has outlawed caste discrimination, its shadows continue to affect millions. And it's not just India. Every continent, every culture has found its own ways to institutionalize inequality. The gender divide, patriarchy in power. Another brutal form of historical inequality Harari confronts is patriarchy. Across nearly every known culture, women were systematically subordinated to men. They were denied political power, economic rights, and bodily autonomy. The big question Harari asks is, why? Why has patriarchy been so persistent, even when women have shown equal intelligence, creativity, and leadership? His answer is provocative. He argues that no biological or evolutionary explanation fully accounts for patriarchy. Instead, it was often the result of social, military, and economic systems that rewarded male dominance. For instance, in ancient agricultural societies, physical strength was more valued, giving men an edge. In militarized societies, aggression and hierarchy favored male-led structures. Over time, these dynamics were sanctified by religion, law, and culture. Even as civilizations advanced, the ideas about women's inferiority were passed down like heirlooms. Race and the fabrication of superiority. Race, like caste and gender, is another construct with no biological basis, but massive social impact. Harari highlights how the concept of race was weaponized during the age of European colonialism, as nations like Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal expanded their empires. They needed a justification for conquest, slavery, and exploitation. That justification came in the form of racial hierarchy. Africans, Asians, and indigenous peoples were labeled as inferior, not because of science, but because of ideology. Harari reminds us that the same Enlightenment thinkers who championed liberty and reason often promoted brutal racial theories. These racist ideas were then institutionalized in laws, education, and even science. Phrenology, eugenics, and other pseudosciences gave racism a veneer of legitimacy that lasted well into the 20th century, and in many ways still lingers. Can we ever have justice? One of the most sobering parts of this chapter is Harari's suggestion that true historical justice is nearly impossible. The damage done by centuries of exploitation, genocide, slavery, and discrimination cannot be easily undone. Even when societies try to rectify past wrongs, through reparations, affirmative action, or public apologies, these efforts often fall short. That's because the structures of inequality are deeply embedded not just in economics, but in culture, psychology, and memory. Moreover, every attempt to dismantle an unjust system is met with fierce resistance. The beneficiaries of past injustices rarely give up their privilege willingly. As Harari notes, revolutions and reforms have succeeded in creating more equal systems in some parts of the world, but never without a struggle. The illusion of meritocracy. A particularly haunting insight in this chapter is how modern societies often disguise inequality under the cloak of meritocracy. We're told that success is the result of hard work, talent, and grit, but Harari warns that this is often a convenient myth, one that allows elites to justify their privilege while ignoring structural advantages. If you're born into wealth, have access to elite schools, and grow up with connections, your path is much smoother. Meanwhile, those born into poverty must fight uphill battles, and are often blamed for their struggles. The result? A cycle of inequality that feels natural but is anything but. Hope or despair? Is Harari saying we're doomed to repeat the sins of the past? Not necessarily. He ends the chapter on a cautious note. While history is filled with injustice, he also acknowledges the moral progress humanity has made. Slavery, once nearly universal, is now outlawed. Women can vote, own property, and run for office. Racial segregation has been dismantled in many places. These changes didn't come easily, but they prove that imagined orders can be rewritten. But he also warns us. New forms of inequality are constantly emerging, through algorithms, economic systems, and geopolitics. The fight for justice is never over. It's a story we're still writing. Chapter 8 of Sapiens is one of the book's most urgent and unsettling chapters. It forces us to look at the scaffolding of our societies and ask who benefits, who suffers, and what stories are we still telling to justify injustice. Harari doesn't give us easy answers, but he gives us the tools to question the systems around us and perhaps to imagine something better. If history is a story, then maybe, just maybe, we can choose a different ending. Thanks for watching. If this breakdown helped you see our past a little more clearly, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments. What forms of injustice do you see today that we might be blind to? Let's keep the conversation going.